Welcome once again to Rebuilding the Collection, or Junkin' and Jiving with Jazz in Lockdown.
Ah,
I'm Paul Palmer. I don't really know what keeps me going with this project. I guess essentially what I'm doing is making an extended document about throwing stuff in the trash. You know, deciding which jazz albums I once accumulated on cassette tape that should be either kept or junked. Perhaps it's the thought of empty drawers and cupboards that spurs me on, along with the satisfaction of knowing that the essential collection of must have albums has been saved for eternity. Or perhaps it's the anticipation of being joined from down the line in Houston, Texas, by my friend and erstwhile colleague, Mr. Eric Blackman, who is helping me with the task. Hi, Eric.
Paul.
How are you going?
Okay, not bad. However, I have things to say about that in a future show because the second year of the pandemic is rough.
Yeah, yeah.
But while we're on that subject briefly, um, I'm able to, although with our prep for this show, by not having these albums we're going to speak of today, I'm able to, for the show and post show, investigate more of what I was ignorant of, which is doing me a huge favor.
Yes, I always find a lot of work is needed on correcting my ignorance, and I think I'm only just beginning. But let's remind everyone that we're discussing my cassette collection by album title in alphabetical order, which allows us to discuss different albums from the same artist in different episodes. I think we got as far as F's in the last video. Hang on, no, that's not right. That script is absolute rubbish. Now we've moved on. We've done F's, haven't we? We've done F's and G's. We're now doing I. We did H as well. So we're now doing I, and I only found one of those, and we're doing J's. There's only a couple of those, so we've got 3 albums to do, and I'm going to give you the list right now. Starting with the I, Lester Bowie's Brass Fantasy, I Only Have Eyes for You, and that came out on ECM in 1985. Quite a relatively, in terms of the ones we do, is quite recent. And then we move on to the J's. George Russell, Jazz in the Space Age, came out on Decca in 1960. And then the Robert Watson Sextet. The album is entitled Jewel, and that came out on Evidence in 1983. Any observations on those 3 albums, just off the top of your head, Eric?
All that clicks with me immediately is that Bobby Watson I became familiar with when I used to go hear Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, and I loved his playing. He's very high energy. And it was a 3-horn front line, and it was still continuing with all the hard-hitting, incisive hard bop. And George Russell, I only knew a little bit of. The Lydian chromatic concept scared me, so I steered clear of it.
We're going to start off with Lester Bowers' Brass Fantasy, and this is called I Only Have Eyes for You. What can I tell you about this album? So, yes, he's bracketed with the avant-garde, isn't he, Lester Bowie? Have you heard much of him, Eric?
No, not an awful lot. Becoming aware of Sun Ra and the whole Chicago jazz movement, I had heard some of Lester Bowie, but
Yeah.
but not enough to remember, and not in recent years. No.
I think in an earlier conversation about him, you suggested he might be a fringe character.
Yes, I did.
Perhaps not as prolific as some of the better known jazz artists, but if we listen to this album, there are lots of special effects. He uses lip what do you call them? These techniques where you smack your lips or you do slides and
The chord,
raspberries, extended raspberries, that sort of thing.
yeah,
But they're there for sort of initial effects. For example, you might get an extended improvisation, and then the melodic thematic material will follow. So let's look at the first track. Well, this is the title track, and it's about 10 minutes long. It's a version of a well-known standard, "I Only Have Eyes for You," which gives its name to the album as well. A pulsing backing from many of the brass instruments, and then a sort of very lilting rendition of the actual tune itself, the melody, which is quite well known. Did you enjoy that?
yes.
And then it moves on to "Think," which is a kind of short, very contemplative track, which again sort of it reminds me of "Self-Portrait in Three Colors," actually, the Mingus track, because it's kind of short. It just goes round a couple of times on the same theme, and then there's a sort of small amount of scope for improvisation around the edges. Okay, if you were me, would you have this in your collection, do you think?
I would, because it's, first of all, it's so different from what I'm most familiar with. And with the recent hearings that you and I both did of the album, it's it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting, and it's different from all the straight ahead stuff that I generally hear. And that art ensemble of Chicago, their kind of ethos and value system and sensibilities, and breaking with all kinds of traditions, um, is very worthy. It definitely belongs under the heading of jazz.
Yeah, he was a member of that art ensemble of Chicago, wasn't he? And
Right.
I can't really get to grips with what that group was all about. Do you know?
Well, I think they were Chicago based, of course. And so what interests me is that they're neither New York, East Coast, or West Coast kind of thing. Um, they're really right in the middle of the country, and they've got being in an alternative place. Chicago is a big blues town, but the Art Ensemble of Chicago, I think, identified Chicago as being a city that is able to come up with uh, a unique take on jazz. You know, Sun Ra and Lester Bowie and all the other horn players, and them painting their faces and wearing whatever they'd like, and presenting a kind of music that comes to mind the soundtrack to the movie Last Tango in Paris, which I believe was Oliver Nelson had a big hand in creating, with Gato Barbieri on tenor saxophone. Or so Oliver Nelson and Mingus come to mind as being things that I readily compare Art Ensemble of Chicago to. It's not your traditional stuff.
Okay, well, you'll have it in your collection, and I'm definitely going to hold on to it.
Yes.
It's very hard, probably be quite hard to digitize because the tracks don't. They almost sort of run into each other, but we'll cope somehow. So let's now go on to the George Russell. This one is called "Jazz in the Space Age," and goodness me, there's a lot to this album. There's a session that was done with certain musicians called Chromatic Universe, and it's in 3 parts, and it's distributed. The parts are distributed throughout the album, and you as you would expect, it's sort of a lot of chromatic playing, particularly on a piano, but there was some solos on other instruments in some of the other parts. Then there's Dimensions, which has a range of moods. It's quite an extensive track. Lots of solos and a tight rhythm section pulsing its way through. There's a lot on this album, actually. Eric, what did you make of it?
I also like it love it for all its differences. Essentially, it reminded me, I was thinking of Leonard Bernstein has, someone's put on YouTube, the 5 greatest moments in classical, the 5 greatest minutes in classical music education. Bernstein is, I think, in either the late 60s or early 70s, speaking of the history of tonal music. And he's speaking about how certainly in the earliest era, there was the overtone series. People used fifths a lot because you've got the first and second partials of the overtone series, and that the overtone series is inclusive of all 12 tones in our 12-tone system. And it's just, for some reason, the George Russell, who's a jazz theoretician, second to none, is evoking these kinds of feelings in me when I listen to this particular album, because the choices that you and I discussed are exploring things in ways that, a horn player with rhythm section playing standards just can't explore. I mean, all of those voices and all of the breaking of some taboos and traditions into musically appealing collages of sound is always welcome.
Yeah, I mean, if you take the Chromatic Universe pieces, you think, oh crikey, this is, there's no tune here, there's no tune. But what I'm hearing is almost like the distillation of jazz, the essence of jazz. It's almost been atomized into its component parts. There's still that idiom going through it, through not necessarily the chord structures, but the way the piano is played, the style, and the rhythm section backing it all up.
Yes.
And then in the Dimensions extended track, there's just, it's episodic. It's going from one thing to another. There's a horn section playing chord changes, and then solos emerge, and there are some really good solos. Trumpets and saxophones. It's all going on. It really, there is a lot. I agree with you, as he is a theoretician, and some of the titles of the tracks give things away. The Chromatic Universe, for example, or the Lydiot, spelled Lydiot. It's as if he's referring, and he never gets away from his master work, the Lydian chromatic concept of tonal organization for improvisation, which is a bit of a mouthful, and was when I was doing a thesis on it many moons ago. So I think it's at once powerful listening. It's a discovery, a journey of discovery, and it's also something that basically is a document of its time, because 1960s, you rightly say, or as you was telling me earlier, it's quite early for this kind of way out sort of ideas to be documented on an album. Don't
I
you think?
agree. It reminds me of a collaboration with, I think, Carla Bley and Charlie Hayden, the Jazz Liberation Orchestra. I have some recordings amongst my stuff of them. And thinking about it as you and I speak now, I don't see how Charlie Hayden or Carla Bley could not have been aware of this album by George Russell. It had to be some part and parcel of their inspiration for what they would do in, I think it was at least the mid 1970s, 15 years later, if not even later than that.
Yeah.
You know, musicians sit around and get wasted and listen to albums. And I mean, this has been a constant thread since way, way back to this very day. I was just reading something online by a very well-known saxophone player where he's talking about doing just this kind of thing. You listen to albums and you listen. I would keep this album in my collection if I had it. So if you'd like to send it to me.
I could send it to you via the ether at some time, at some point.
Well, there's a lot of space here. I have an awful lot of room, which has caused me endless trouble.
You wouldn't want it on a plastic cassette, though, would you?
I'll take it any way I can get it.
Oh, well, that's steady on, you know. That's
Steady on. I haven't heard that in 13 years, Paul, since I left England. Steady on.
Well, I still have that reserve, you know. Regardless, it's still there. Well, great. I agree with you. We can hold on to George Russell, and let's now talk about the Jewel, which is the Robert Watson Sextet, and I can only say I've a lot of admiration for this album, and I enjoy listening to it. And from the very start, I think you know what Robert, or as he professionally became known, Bowie, Michael Watson. I guess this is is this early in his career? What date did we say it was? 1985.
85, so I guess right around the time he was with the Jazz Messengers, or perhaps finishing up with the Jazz Messengers. I went to some club down in the Village back around this time, and he and Curtis Lundy were playing. I was taken with how tall and skinny they both were, because they were walking amongst us all as we were seated at tables. And he was playing acoustically, and it was really great. I think he was doing mostly standards, but he's always brought something new and different and refreshing to anything he does.
Yeah. So right from the first track, the style and approach is clear. Very accessible melodic jazz tunes. I think he creates quite a few of them. Let's have a look.
Yeah, he's a very melodic player. Very melodic player.
To See Her Face is a nice up-tempo number that he's written, and it's really great. Then comes Orange Blossom, which is a Lundy composition, Orange Blossom, which is a ballad, as well as Jewel. Then you've got, I think You're Lucky to Me. It's not the full sextet. Let's see who's on it all together. There's in the sextet Watson, Mulgrew, Miller, Steve Nelson, the vibe player, Marvin Smitty Smith, the drummer, percussionist Don Umbra Mayer, Curtis Lundy, of course, and in which track was I saying? I think it's called You're Lucky to Me. I think it's just three people. It's the percussionist playing on conga drums, and piano, and the sax, I think. I can't think that there's a bass in it. And it's just a great sort of buoyant, effervescent track. So there's plenty to enjoy on this album, and I think you'd be churlish not to have it in your collection, wouldn't you?
Well, I was going to say that anything with Mulgrew Miller or Kenny Kirkland is the other pianist of that generation. The torch had been passed in essence from Herbie Hancock, McCoy Tyner, Chick Corea, Keith Jarrett, the older generation, to those two, amongst some others, but really principally those two. I heard Mulgrew Miller with Betty Carter. I heard Mulgrew Miller with, I think, the Messengers. And then there's Kenny Kirkland with Branford Marsalis and Wynton Marsalis in the early days. But anything that I've ever heard that those two pianists are associated with is some meaningful stuff. I think I had passed this comment in a previous episode of ours that, virtually anything of Miles Davis or Coltrane, you just buy it. And there are a host of other people like that, of course, because they could do no wrong.
You'll have noticed there's nothing here from the 21st century or even the 1990s, obviously because cassette tapes are very much before the CD era. But since we're looking at artists or albums with names alphabetically from the beginning of the alphabet, let's take a moment to review more modern offerings, beginning with, I guess, I and J today, because that's what we're looking at from the modern era. And I think we're so rubbish at this sort of job, Eric, that I think we've got to make sure this is a call to arms to anyone who listens to this show. Can you think, please, of albums which should be in my collection, or the collection? We're calling it the collection rather than my collection, that come from the modern era, and they begin with I and J, along with all the ones that we've done so far that we've missed. And at the same time, I think, have there been albums beginning with I and J, because we again couldn't think of any, that should have been in the original collection when I was making it back in the 80s. Well, there we go. If you do have anything on that to say about that, then you can contact us. Please tweet us using the hashtag collection build, or tweet directly to us at collection build. That's all one word. Or of course you can, or I say of course, let me just tell you, my email is collectionbuild@gmail.com. That's collectionbuild, again all one word, @gmail.com. Okay, and I think that just about wraps it up, Eric. We didn't do that many albums, but I think the ones we did were very interesting and very worthy. Anything more you'd like to add?
I agree completely. They're very worthy and very interesting and off the beaten path, which, is good.
Yeah, and that's half the point of this. Okay, so thanks for being with us today, and I hope you have enjoyed our deliberations. Next time, we'll roll on to some new alphabetical offerings. So see you then. My thanks to you, Eric.
Thank you.
This has been Rebuilding the Collection, and I'm Paul Palmer.